If you're a continental knitter who wants to do stranded color work, you are in luck because you have several different knitting methods available for you and you can choose the one that's the most convenient for you. Welcome to Sorceress Crafts channel. Today we are having a very hands-on tutorial. In this tutorial I will show you 4 different ways how you can knit stranded color work. For each of the methods I will show you both knit and purl stitches. So after this you will be able to knit color work both on round and flat. I also show how to properly hold yarns for the proper color dominance, and for each of the styles I will show how to catch floats. Just a quick note on few things that you will see in this video. I will be showing the knitting technique on one sample and then catching floats on another sample because it will be simply easier to understand. And in both of my samples you will very often see my stitches changing the positions, how they are positioned on the needles, and it's because I will be showing this tutorial for both Eastern and Western stitches. So it's very likely when I start a new method I still have the stitches standing in the previous way on my needles. I can promise you I am not twisting the stitches anywhere in this video. You normally don't do that in stranded color work, and the only bit that you need to remember about knitting non-twisted stitches is that you always go through the leg that's closest to the needle tip, regardless of how your stitch is standing on the needle. And by the way, so this is a Western mounted stitch, so the leading leg is in front of the needle, and this is an Eastern mounted stitch where the leading leg is behind the needle. They function the exact same way. And if you are confused about the whole Eastern or Western mounted stitches or why would it ever happen, I have a video here explaining the differences between all 3 continental knitting styles. And now let's get into knitting. Let's start with the most versatile stranded knitting method. It's where you hold all of the yarns on your finger at once. You are going to hold the dominant yarn closest to the knit and non-dominant yarn farthest away from the knit. And of course there are many different ways how to place the yarns on your fingers, but this is how I like to do it. So I put the dominant yarn over my index finger and the non-dominant yarn over my middle finger, and then the pinky is holding tension for both yarns like this. I always keep the yarns very close to my knit. And then you simply follow your color chart and pick the yarn that you need for the knit. For the non-dominant yarn you will always go over, and for the dominant yarn of course you don't have to cross the other yarn at all. With this method it's fairly easy to manage your floats because you are tensioning both yarns at the same time, and you don't really need to worry about the float length because both yarns are moving along at the same rate. For the wrong side you will tension the yarn in the exact same way. This might feel a bit counterintuitive, but it's actually not. The important bit is that simply on the wrong side the dominant yarn goes under the non-dominant yarn. On the purl side, of course, things get a bit more complicated, but it's honestly really not that bad because you only have to think about the yarn that you will be using. So if you need the non-dominant yarn, it's super easy. You just pick it up, and then when you need the dominant yarn, you simply leave the non-dominant yarn over your needle and knit like this. Just be careful not to bring it to the front of your work. But honestly, if you tension your yarn like this, the yarns will pretty automatically just want to stay where you need them. And of course, this is the Eastern purl that I'm showing right now. For the Western purl, you leave the yarns in the same position. You simply wrap the yarn in a different way. For Western purl in color work, I usually like to push the yarn with my index finger like this. But of course, if it's more convenient for you, you can also use your thumb. It doesn't really matter. But I'll be honest, in color work, the combination style really shines because the Eastern purl is just way easier. In this method, catching floats is very easy. When you need to catch the dominant yarn, so you are knitting with the non-dominant yarn and you need to catch the float of the dominant yarn, insert needle in the stitch, go under the dominant yarn, and just pull through the non-dominant yarn, and then for the next stitch go over the dominant yarn and you have caught a float. To catch a float of non-dominant yarn, insert needle in the stitch, go under both yarns and make the stitch with the dominant yarn. And if you see the non-dominant yarn pulling through like this a bit, you can simply tug a bit on the yarn and then continue knitting as normal. If you're an Eastern knitter, the principle is basically the same. Again, go under the dominant yarn and make the stitch with the non-dominant yarn. And you have successfully caught a float for the dominant yarn. And then if you're knitting with the dominant yarn and you need to catch the non-dominant yarn, it will be a bit easier than with the Western knitting, because you can go simply under the non-dominant yarn and knit like this, and you have successfully caught the float. And the float shouldn't be showing anywhere through the fabric. However, there might be some peeking through if you are knitting at a very loose gauge. Like here, if I stretch this out, you can see some of the yarn peeking through. But normally, if you are keeping the tension, and especially after the blocking, the floats should not show on the right side of the fabric. Of course, you also might need to catch the floats while you're purling. For the Western purl, if you need to catch the dominant yarn, insert needle, let both yarns go over the needle, hold the dominant yarn with your thumb, and then make the purl like this. Then make sure that the yarns are back in the correct order and continue purling as normally. To catch the non-dominant float, insert needle, pull both yarns under the needle, and then with your thumb make the stitch and return the yarns to the normal order and keep purling as per usual. Now for the Eastern purl, insert needle, leave the dominant yarn over the needle and push the non-dominant yarn over so you can see it's crossing on 2 points, and make the stitch as per usual. And then make sure that the yarns are returned to the correct order and keep purling as per usual. And now to catch the non-dominant yarn, insert needle, with your thumb pull down the non-dominant yarn and make the stitch as per usual. And then you can continue purling. If catching floats for the wrong side feels too fiddly with this method, I highly encourage you to keep knitting the same way. Even if catching floats on the purl side seems too complicated for this method, you can still keep knitting with this method, but for the purl side, you could also look at the method number 2 and see how the floats are caught there on the purl side. Maybe that might feel easier for you. In general, it's fine to knit with the first method on the right side and with the second method on the wrong side. For this method, you can also easily use a knitting thimble. I don't use them because I simply haven't found one that would be comfortable for me, that would fit my fingers, because my fingers are pretty small. But if you have one that works for you, that's amazing. In this style, you also don't need to worry about the color dominance, because how you tension the yarns means that you are never mixing them up. They are not getting tangled. The only drawback that I can see for this method is that it might be harder for beginners to learn, and the learning curve might be a bit steeper. Another smaller drawback is that this method gets a bit difficult if you are knitting with fluffy yarns, or if you are holding each color double, like if you would be working with the main yarn plus mohair and you would be doing it for both colors. In those cases, I would recommend the last method that I'm going to show in this video. But overall, this is definitely the most versatile method and the one that I would always recommend for general stranded knitting purposes. Next up, we have a simplified stranded knitting method where you're only holding one yarn at a time. So you make all of the stitches that you need with this yarn, and then you are going to drop it and you're going to pick up the other yarn and work with that one for as many stitches as you need. It's important to note that the dominant color always goes on the bottom and the non-dominant color comes over. So when you are switching the yarns, it's always important to keep the same order. This might be the most natural stranded colorwork knitting method, because basically you are not doing anything new or anything special. With this method, you have to be extra careful to leave floats that are long enough. Otherwise, your work will start puckering up. And to do that, you have to make sure that when you're changing the colors, the stitches on your right hand needle are laying completely flat and that you're not pulling too much on the yarn that you are working with currently. And then you just keep knitting by changing the colors like this. Over time, you also might be able to learn to switch between them like pretty automatically, so it takes less time and it's less of an interruption for your workflow, but it's very important not to cross them, meaning that you're not always picking them one over other like this. This method is also extra easy on the purl side, because you are again working with only one color. And same as on knit side, it's important to change the colors the same way all of the time, the non-dominant color over the dominant color. And then the dominant color comes under the non-dominant color like this. And of course, remember to leave floats that are long enough, but on this side they are super easy to see, so you don't have to do any guesswork. For this method where you are holding only one yarn at a time, people very often will take their yarns and just rotate them in order to create a twist between the yarns, or rotate them like this where you're holding both strands and just do 2 twists and then keep knitting while holding the one that you did not want to catch. While this is totally valid method, I don't entirely like it. First of all, it's very easy to create a float that's too short with that. Second, I really don't like twisting my yarn all the time. And third, this can create unwanted bumps on the wrong side of the fabric that sometimes might show off in places where you don't want them to be. So a better method for this would be, with your right hand, take the yarn that you need to catch, put it over your working yarn like this, hold it lightly, make the stitch, and then put the yarn back. And you have successfully created a float. Just like that. When you're catching the dominant yarn, in theory you can also go over for catching the float. It might mildly mess with the color dominance in some cases. You need to check that for your own yarn. If it doesn't mess with your color dominance, just keep doing this. That's the easiest method. If it messes with your color dominance, remember we are always changing the dominant yarn under. What you could do instead is drop the working yarn, pull up the dominant yarn, hold it like this, make the stitch with your working yarn, and then switch the yarns back. And you have successfully created a float. As you can see here, the dominant yarn is successfully caught here. I will say, if you have to do color work flat, this might be your best option. Sure, holding both yarns is very convenient, and if you are proficient in color work, that will be no issue for you. But if you are just beginning, this might be the best method to start out with, especially on the purl side. And it would be completely fine to mix the previous method with this one. So on the right side, you can hold both yarns, and on the wrong side, you can do this method with just one yarn. I would say that the best bonus for this method is that it's pretty intuitive. The biggest negative for this method is that handling floats is a bit more difficult, and you really need to look out for your tension and make sure that the floats are not getting too short and that you're not puckering up your work. And another huge drawback for this method for me personally is that it breaks up my knitting flow. I don't really care that much that it might be slower, or I don't care which method might be faster, but the fact that I need to change the yarns like this and that I always need to think about the floats is just really messes with my flow, and I like my knitting to be more smooth, and I prefer not to drop yarns or change how I'm tensioning them or fiddle with them that much. So while this method has its bonuses, I personally never choose it, because it simply breaks apart my knitting into those small chunks, and I don't enjoy that experience. But just because this method is very simple doesn't mean it's bad, and if this works for you, amazing, I love that for you, you should absolutely go with this. Now, this next method is kind of a social media phenomenon where suddenly people started seeing more how other people knit and then started taking like best things from each side. So in this method, you are actually combining continental knitting with English knitting. You will be holding your dominant yarn in your left hand and your non-dominant yarn in your right hand. So you are knitting continental with dominant yarn and English with non-dominant yarn. The continental stitches look as per usual, but now for the non-dominant yarn you are doing English knitting. To knit the English style stitches, hold your yarn in the right hand. I like to tension it like this, so it's basically the same way as I do for continental knitting, I do it for the English knitting. As always, that is personal preference. You might want to do it in a different way, that's up to you. To make a knit stitch, insert needle knitwise in the leg that's closest to the needle tip. Take this yarn and wrap it around the needle from back to front and pull through, and you have created a stitch. This is called the throwing method for English style. You can also use the flicking method, which means that you are not letting go of the needle and you're not like wrapping the yarn with your whole hand. Insert needle knitwise and now just go around the needle with your finger and pull through. Flicking method is a bit faster and it might be a bit easier for continental knitters to understand. Of course, the stitches that I just showed you were Western mounted, but you can also make Eastern mounted stitches with English knitting method if you are so inclined. So for example, if you are an Eastern continental knitter who wants to use this method, then this is how you would make the stitches with your right hand. Insert needle knitwise, and this time you are wrapping the yarn from front to back. So you put the yarn between the needles, wrap it around and pull through. And that's how you are creating an Eastern mounted stitch with English knitting method. To create a Western mounted purl, insert needle purlwise, wrap the yarn from back to front and pull through. And of course, this can also be done by throwing method or by flicking. And of course, Western mounted stitches are the ones that you will see most often in any English knitting tutorials. To create an Eastern purl, insert your needle purlwise, wrap your yarn from front to back and pull through. And of course, the Eastern purl would be used both in combination and Eastern knitting. A thing to immediately note about this method is that for this one, you will need to pay the most attention from all of the methods to your tension. Because normally, continental and English knitting styles create stitches that differ in how tight they are, and especially if you are using flicking, you risk running into a thing where the stitches that you make with the non-dominant yarn are way tighter than the ones that you make with the other yarn. And also, of course, you need to pay attention to your float length. You have to make sure that the floats are long enough to accommodate the stitches. And as you can probably see, this is a method that I personally don't use, so it also looks a bit awkward for me. And I'm definitely not the most proficient person when it comes to this particular method for knitting stranded color work. As is the case with other color work methods, when you are catching floats in this method, you are also basically just crossing and uncrossing the yarns. To catch the float for the dominant yarn, insert right hand needle in the stitch. With your left hand, pull the dominant yarn over the stitch so it mimics this stitch. Then make the stitch as before, pull through, and you have basically caught a float already. As you can see, it perfectly disappears because the floats just mimic this little purl bar. To catch the non-dominant yarn, this one that's in your right hand, insert the needle, cross the non-dominant yarn over the dominant yarn like this, hold it with your left hand, make the stitch as per normal, and then take back the yarn. And you have successfully caught the float. And you can simply keep knitting. And so the non-dominant yarn floats always look like this. They go kind of under the purl bump. They don't mimic the purl bump as much. To catch the non-dominant yarn on the purl side, put it between the needles and the yarn. Then make your purl stitch as per usual and simply uncross the yarns again. And then you can keep purling as per usual. And to catch the dominant yarn, insert needle purlwise, put the yarn here between the needles like that, just leave it there. Wrap the yarn to make the purl stitch, pull through, and you have successfully caught a float. just like that. And of course, it shouldn't be showing anywhere on the right side. I'd say that the biggest bonus for this method is that your yarns are never tangling up, and it should be fairly easy to follow the patterns because it's easier to remember which yarn is which because you are just holding them in your different hands. And well, some people just find this more convenient. As you might see here, I'm not one of those people. This is not my preferred method, but I really wanted to include it in this video because currently it's a really popular method, and I think it's just good to know several different ways how to knit. The drawback for this method is that, well, you need to learn a whole new learning system. And especially if you are already an experienced knitter, then learning to handle the working yarn with your right hand might not be all that easy. I know that I certainly struggled to learn this. And with this method, it's a bit harder to handle the floats. You really need to be careful how long you are leaving them. I can already see that while I was talking, I have left them a bit too short here. But what you need to be most careful about, stitches in both yarns come out in the same size. That you are not falling for the thing where the stitches that you are making with English knitting method are way tighter than the ones that you are making with the continental knitting method. Now, the next method is something that you will see very, very rarely in the wild. And for this method, we are combining Western and Eastern knit stitches. So we are basically doing like a weird variation of combination continental style, but on the same side. For this, you will be holding the yarns the same way as for the first knitting method. You are holding both yarns on your fingers. Dominant yarn is going over my index finger. Non-dominant yarn is going over my index finger and middle finger. With the dominant yarn, you are using the usual Western knit stitch. And of course, you are making it through the leg that's closest to your needle tip. This will be very important to remember for this method. However, with the non-dominant yarn, you are using the Eastern knit stitch, which means you insert needle as per usual, but you wrap the yarn from behind to the front. So basically, when you go to pick up the yarns, you are always inserting your needle between the yarns, and this is an important point. And then you wrap the yarn around like this. And of course, if you know anything about Eastern and Western mounts, then you will know that this method creates stitches that will be mounted different ways on your needles. The non-dominant yarn will always be on the Eastern mount, so the closest leg to the needle tip will always be behind the needle. And meanwhile, with your dominant yarn, you are creating Western mounted stitch, which means that the leg that's closest to the needle tip is going to be in front of your needle. And of course, we are always making stitches through the leg that's closest to the needle tip. Now, why would you use an outlandish method like this? I first started using this method when I was knitting my light fall sweater, and there for one color, I was holding together several yarns. I wouldn't have just 2 strands of yarn on my finger, I would have 3 or 4. And also those yarns were extremely fluffy. And so if I did the usual knitting method where I just go in to pick whichever yarn I need, the yarns kept sticking together. However, if I use this method, where the needle always goes between the yarns, I am never accidentally picking up fluff or like mohair strand from the other yarn. I'm only picking up what I need. And because I'm already a combination knitter, I really just don't care which way my stitches are standing on the needles. Honestly, I kind of don't even pay attention to that. My hands just pretty automatically adjust to how the stitches are mounted on my needle. And they are actually way easier to distinguish than it sounds, because remember, each color will always be mounted the same way on your needles. The stitches of the same color are not going to be mounted differently. The difference is only between the colors, and so even visually you get a very nice reminder on what you have on the needles. But of course, you also need to use the same Eastern-Western distinction on your purl side. So you will also be doing Eastern and Western purls for this. So the Eastern purl is pretty easy. You just scoop through the yarn. And again, very important to remember to open your stitches. Don't make twisted stitches. You are always making the stitch through the leg that's closest to the needle tip. And here comes a mild drawback for this knitting system is that sometimes you will need to do the Western purl through the leg that's behind the needle, and for some people that might be fiddly. But honestly, in knitting, fiddly just usually means that you are simply not used to doing it. When I first started learning this method, I kind of thought that I would not be using this method for the purl side because I don't particularly like the Western purl method. But honestly, I just got used to it and it really isn't all that bad. To catch the float of the non-dominant yarn, insert needle, go under both yarns like this and make the stitch like that. And then continue knitting normally. To catch the float of the dominant yarn, insert needle, go under both yarns, then between and make the stitch like this. And you have successfully caught the float and you can keep knitting. To catch the float of the non-dominant yarn, insert needle purlwise, put both yarns under the needle and then with your thumb push over the working yarn and make the stitch. And from there on you can continue purling as per normal. And you have successfully caught the float and it will look like this. And then to catch the float of the dominant yarn, insert needle purlwise. With your needle literally catch the dominant yarn so you can see they are crossed now, and just make the stitch with the yarn that you need, and then you can keep purling as per normal and you have successfully caught the float and it will look like this. I have already explained the biggest positive side for this method. This method is very easy to use when you are holding your yarns double with a mohair or if you're knitting simply with fluffy yarns. But also for me, this very effortlessly gave me the best tension for the color work I've ever seen. And I mean, my tension isn't all too shabby as it is, but this one just felt marvelous. And I could especially see it when I'm knitting color work with cotton or other yarns that where you really can't afford to make any mistakes. And similarly as with the first method, I really like how this one handles floats because the yarns are tensioned together all of the time. So that means I don't need to worry about my work puckering up too much or maybe being too loose. For me, the problem usually is puckering up, not being too loose. Drawbacks for this method are pretty obvious. If you're not used to combination knitting, this whole thing about changing how your stitches are mounted might be very confusing and might lead to twisted stitches if you are not careful. And while catching floats in this method also is bit more complicated or a bit more fiddly. But overall, I just want to encourage you to try this one. It's a really interesting thing and you will never know until you try if you actually like it or no. When I first learned about this, I was so skeptical. Let me tell you, even though I've been a combination knitter for my whole life, I was so damn skeptical about this. But now I'm completely sold to this. The most important thing that I want you to take away from this video, you can choose whichever knitting method works for you. On this swatch alone, I've worked with 4 different knitting methods and you can't really tell where I have switched between them because in the end, all of them create the same fabric. You will be getting the same result regardless of which method you use. But you will simply have easier time knitting if you are using a method that works for you personally. And while I have very clearly in this video mentioned my personal favorites, they are never meant to say that this or that method is better or that this method is complete trash. I'm just saying that I personally prefer those methods and you might have completely different preferences. I will say though, please don't change your knitting style in the middle of the project. always try out new methods on swatches, because especially at first, when you are just learning the methods, your attention will be all over the place, and while you're learning, things will just get wobbly, wonky, and you will really regret changing the method mid-project. That's one of the reasons why we always knit swatches. They are for training, so I really encourage you to knit up several swatches and find out which method works best for you. And it's also completely fine to switch to a different method if you realize that the one that you are using isn't working for you anymore. I sincerely hope this tutorial was helpful to you. If you have any further questions about how to catch floats or how to use any of those methods, let me know in the comments. And if you would like to support me making tutorials like this, I also have a Buy Me Coffee account where you can choose either between one-time payment or a subscription method. Just a quick note on that, there is no extra content in that account. I have promised myself that all of my knitting tutorials will always be for free. I don't want my crafting tutorials be behind a paywall, because I truly believe that the world would be a better place if everyone could learn to craft and they wouldn't have to pay for it. And I just want to share the crafting knowledge the same way as it was shared with me. So if you can and if you choose to support me, I am deeply grateful, and it will make more tutorials like this possible. Thank you, and I will see you in the next video. On the purl. I heard it.